We're all good. Okay, you're watching World IA Day 2021 with me, Mike Atherton, and Maria Smirnova behind the scenes pressing all the buttons. Yeah, I think that's working. Okay. Seamless, flawless it is. You can tell this is a very slick event. Right, our next speaker is David Bailey. He's an information architect at Snyk, which is a company that helps open source developers around the world be more productive and more secure. Part of doing that is making sure documentation stays in sync. Based on the continuous integration, continuous delivery processes of software engineering itself, he's developed a way of creating technical documentation and keeping it aligned with development and making people more empowered to create and manage content. As always, if you have a question for David, post it in the chat during the talk and we'll get to the questions at the end. So over now to David Bailey to tell us more about adopting CI/CD for documentation release. Take it away, David.
Hi, everybody. As is traditional, I need to check the optional things. Can you see my screen when I share my screen in a second? Okay, so you should all see it now. Is that good? Excellent. Okay. Good. So this has a slight change to the title. When I wrote this was CI/CD for documentation. I've now taken on more responsibility for overall content. So this is still pretty much accurate, but I've just changed the title here and there. Hopefully it still all makes perfect sense. So this is me, David Bailey. So I've been a technical communications professional for about 20 years. I started out as a technical writer and I still dabble in that. Probably, I guess, about 8 to 10 years ago, I transitioned to being an information architect when I realized that where the information was, finding it, categorizing it, developing a taxonomy was actually more important than writing good content, although they're both important, of course. So I've joined Snyk. Snyk. Don't worry about the pronunciation. Some people call it Snyk, some people call it Snyk. We actually have an FAQ about that, believe it or not. I joined in September last year, and I've been working with the content providers there. My job, one of my parts of my job is to manage user content, including feature-related content. And we'll talk about that in a second. So what we talk about is I'll go into what Snyk is as a company, how it works, what we're doing. I'll then outline some of the problems we're having within this particular area of feature content and the solution we're adopting or have adopted, which is CI/CD or continuous integration, continuous delivery as a model for content delivery. And then we'll finish off with a few reflections on ideas, how to get there. If you're interested, some suggestions, some thoughts on that way. Okay, so Snyk. So Snyk as a company offers software products for secure cloud native development, which means basically if you have vulnerabilities in your source code, open source libraries as a developer, then Snyk can help you. It can identify those vulnerabilities and help you fix them. We are obviously selling this to developers. We have a very much a clear, defined developer first mentality. That's what we sell to. That's what we're about. It's one of our core values. It's very much a fast growing company. So we started 5 years ago, and when I joined 5 months ago, I had 350 employees. We've now got 500. So it's definitely growing. We are also looking to hire information architects. So if you're interested, there's a quick plug for that. As a company, we have lots and lots of content, and we have lots and lots of platforms for that content. This is kind of like historical. We've been very keen on adopting new tools, new technologies, which is good and bad. Sometimes arguably fickle, too fickle. And that's a good thing in terms of adoption of change, but it does mean that we do have quite a lot of different platforms to put content on. So we have a lot of software features that are being developed frequently. They're developed in Agile sprints, so development processes in Agile, and by small teams. I think at last count, we had over 30 teams, depending on how you count them, creating content or creating features, creating functionality. So looking at the content in a bit more detail, we have quite a lot of features. Generally, we can have maybe 2 or 3 features in a day, or possibly 2 or 3 in a week, but pretty much every 1 or 2 days, there is a new feature to tell users about. That new feature requires a certain level of content, including, of course, documentation, product docs, API docs, release announcements, everything that you'd expect from any new feature. We also need training content, so webinars, videos, demonstrations. We need content for support FAQs and so on, and blog content to actually announce the feature if necessary. So lots and lots of content for each individual feature we release, and we release a lot of them very frequently. As you can see, that's quite a lot of content, and it's quite fast. So my first.
Why do we have to cut these things so damn close?
Hey, it works. Child of the 80s, what can I say? We are very much in a position where if you've been involved in creating and producing and delivering information for releases, you do tend to do this at the end of the process. So if we looked at an extremely simple design, development, release process, about as simple as I could possibly make it, what should happen in it, and this depends on whether it's waterfall, applies to Agile, applies to pretty much everything you release. You start out with a design, you then create that, you develop it based on that design, you create content, information, training, technical documentation, and so on, based on the developed feature after it's being developed, and then you can deploy it all. In theory, that should be fantastic. It should just work. What actually happens is, yes, okay, you get a design, you get development, which can stretch quite a long way, can be later than normal. Typically, then that means that the content gets pushed over to the right. So it gets further and further along in the development process, and it tends to get squashed in between development and deployment. And honestly, that's an optimistic view. It may even go after the deployment. So that's not great. It's a problem because it means that you don't get to create content earlier. You have to do it all at the end of the process. It takes a long time, so you're squashing this at the end of the delivery cycle. And it also means that the content may not be very good because you're having to rush it. It may not get time to mature or to be reviewed. And of course, if you look at who's actually doing this work, design is being done by the subject matter experts, as is development. The people in the teams that are doing it, they're creating it, they know what they're doing. The content often is being done by external content specialists, so technical writers, trainers, and so on. And then you're back possibly to the SMEs or deployment teams to actually deploy and deliver the release, the function. So you've got a discrepancy there. Content is being done by somebody else. That's a problem. It can be an issue. We could do some things here, and I've worked for companies that have done these type of solutions. So for example, you could say, okay, let's put a writer or a trainer in each development team. So you've got a development team of 6 people, maybe. Let's put a writer in each of those teams. Bear in mind, that's just, we've got 30 teams, so we would have to recruit 30 writers. We'd also, it just doesn't scale. So also, we'd be removing, again, ownership from the people who are actually developing the functionality, creating it, defining it, working on it, to an external owner. So it's basically probably not feasible to do that. Other companies I've worked for have spread out writers across multiple teams or trainers. So you've got information professionals trying to cover 2, 3, maybe even 4 different Scrum teams. Of course, if you've been involved in a Scrum team, you know that there's a lot of meetings. You could be involved in a couple of hours of meetings every day, every team. So if you're involved in 4 teams, you've got 8 hours of meetings a day. You've got no time to actually do anything but go on to meetings. And of course, that's great if all you do is meetings, but if you want to do some actual work, you just can't do that. So it doesn't scale. Again, it doesn't scale well. You're less involved, you've got less productivity, and it's almost the worst of both worlds. Finally, if you look at Scrum methodology, and if you look at Scrum methodology, it's not really clear what you should do with people like writers, with trainers, or even really testers. It's a little bit vague on that. So you're kind of left to your own devices. Basically, Agile, that's kind of Agile workflow doesn't work for the type of thing that we're talking about in terms of the content as it works at the moment. So it's not really a good solution for us. So again, we've got a problem.
Do you never worry?
Would it help?
Words of wisdom there. Hopefully we can apply that to all of our situations. So what we've come up with, what we're implementing at Snyk, is a solution which is based on our CI/CD model, applying that to the content that we create. So the core part of this is that we shift left and we shift down. We get content that's created earlier by shifting left earlier in the development cycle, and it's created by shifting down ownership by feature experts who are in the teams themselves. So this is the people who actually define, own, and implement the functionality. They also own the content, the training, the documentation, the other information resources associated with that particular feature. Shifting left gives us better productivity because we create more content earlier on in the cycle. It also increases knowledge sharing because, again, you've got content that's available earlier. You can share it more. More people are more aware of it, both within the team and externally to the team as well. Shifting down means pushing the ownership of that to the individuals who are doing the work. So it pushes the content responsibility down to these SMEs. So if we go back to our very simple diagram, the bad old practice, squashing our content over to the right, very late, very difficult to develop, very difficult to manage. The new practice, and of course, if you look at who was doing it, again, it was the external content people who got squashed and weren't involved in the process. The new practice, everything is done, content is done from the start, everything is done by the SMEs. That's the general process that we follow for all of our features. We ensure that content is owned by the SMEs, by the people in the teams. Typically, there'll be product managers, but by the SMEs in the teams, and it's developed earlier on in the process, all the way through the development process. So, for example, you could probably, arguably, write the documentation almost as part of the design and then tweak it as you go along the developments, and maybe 80% will be there for design. And then as you tweak it, you get to the development process, maybe another 10 or 20% development, and then it's pretty much ready to deploy nice and early in the process. So where I fit in, because obviously we've put all the content ownership to the teams, what do I do? What's my role? My role is, or part of the things that I do, one of my roles is to define and implement this as a process, to actually say, this is the process we should be using at Snyk, this is how it works. I then ensure that the process gets managed. So I ensure that for each feature that gets released, there are a number of checklists to follow. I review and edit content. So I'm an editor-in-chief as well as the champion of this particular process. Secondly, I can't just say, right, okay, go write the content, you're on your own. I have to do a number of things to help support people to do this, to help them to create good content. So creating good practice, establishing good practice by writing a set of what good looks like content and putting a set of good videos up to say, this is the type of thing you should do as a template. That always helpful. And of course, supporting them by training and promoting the content, ensuring that internally that this is a process people use and are happy with, and of course, providing the resources they need to actually do the work. So this includes style guides, includes online resources, Grammarly and other applications that they can use, putting all that into their hands so that they can create this content themselves, making them effectively first draft technical writers in many ways, so that we can spread that ownership a lot amongst the company. Good thing is, of course, the good thing is it works. It actually does work. It's an effective process. The content now is being created by the subject matter experts, and it is being delivered at an early stage in the feature development process. So that's great. It works. We're really happy with that. It's not perfect, but it is an improvement. So I'm rolling out training to the people who are writing content. So that's probably about this month. I've trained about 40 people. On average, we don't have to train everyone, but as many people as we can is the aim. So probably within another 2 or 3 months, most of the people who are involved in this process will be trained, and we'll be happy with that. Definitely the people we're training are very happy with the process. They're really keen on this, and they completely appreciate the fact that they're being given this ownership. So that's great. And content creation itself is embedded in the feature planning process. So as part of any new feature, the content creation and when it's done and who does it, this is embedded in the process. So it's written into the feature plan. You can't progress beyond a certain stage in a feature development without having done this work. So that's all great. It's so far so good. We'll always need to tweak these things. Anytime you implement a new process, you'll have to do that. And it's an ongoing process. Absolutely, it's part of my job on an ongoing basis to do this work. So, some thoughts, some reflections, how I got there, some ideas and suggestions in terms of the people, the culture, and the processes. And here we start. So you can't just make stuff up, obviously. You need to define what good looks like. What's the plan? What are you aiming for? What are you trying to achieve with this? What are the benefits? As any project plan, you have to start with that, a goal. And of course, you know, blindingly obvious in some ways, but if you need a return on your investment, you need the investment. You've got to put the investment in at the start. So that's people. So it's not just people like hiring information architects, it's people in terms of giving people who are doing the work time to be trained up, to develop their own skills in this particular area, and giving them the systems and the tools and the resources they need to be able to do that particular job. So it's people training and tools, all of that needs investment. You also need to consider the organization culture. Fair to say that Snyk is a really good culture to implement this solution in. It's a new startup that we have a lot of really good people. They're very helpful, very useful to have someone who's really keen on this as a structure. And it means that they embrace change as a general philosophy, and that helps to push this as a system. It's not impossible to do it in other companies. I did this in my previous company as well, but depending on how much of a company culture you have, which is embracing or resistant to change, it will take more time. I mean, my previous company was more resistant to change. Probably took about 18 months to get this embedded. So it takes time. And that needs investment as well. And so for this part of the job that I do, I need to be a champion of the process. I need to be a trainer, training people up on this process. And of course, I need to be a project manager. I do need to keep track of what features are being developed. I do need to ensure that everything is working as it should do and resolving any issues that come across. So lots of different hats that you wear apart from the rest of the work I do in information architecture. And the last video.
I say good business is where you find it.
Can never go wrong with a classic RoboCop video. So you should work with the company culture you've got. Don't try and just implement this and plonk it down and try and expect it will work. It has to be organic. It has to match where possible, the business model. So for example, with Snyk, our entire philosophy, what we sell is about CI/CD. It's about shifting left and shifting down for our product, getting more of our product involved, much more at product-led growth level with individual users, individual developers. So that's what our business model is. So it's much easier to implement an internal structure that follows our business model, if that makes sense. Other companies obviously will have different business models, and you have to fit and tweak the processes and the changes you're trying to put into to fit that model, because it's much easier for people to understand it. It's basically doing what you know, but doing it in the right way. Some thoughts, some suggestions, some ideas to take away maybe. So whenever any change, of course, but certainly for this one, get an initial buy-in from management. Make sure that you've got a clear goal, what you want to achieve from management. And bear in mind, this is an ongoing process. This is something that keeps requiring investment. Make sure there's a continual buy-in from management. Sometimes, certainly information architecture and documentation information tends to move around structures, and it's sometimes difficult to get that continuous support. So it can be difficult, but it has to be within a communications business. So ensure that this is communicated correctly, communicated well, and constantly. And we need to sell it. We need to be salesmen of a change in process. Change is difficult. It's always a challenge. You've got, if there's one thing we've learned from the past year, that we've had resistance to change, going online, doing all the things that we've done over the past year, just for the COVID epidemic, it's shown there's been a lot of change and a lot of disruption. So it's always a challenge. All I can say is try and make it less of a disruptive technology challenge and a process challenge, if at all possible. Don't try and go for everything at once. Definitely try to make an incremental process. I usually say, my usual term is baby steps, but definitely try and make the transition as easy as possible. And make sure that it's not just a procedure that you write down and expect people to do. That's not going to happen even in the best company. So you have to talk to people a lot, one-to-one training or small group training, providing the resources, again, emphasizing that this is a continuous and ongoing commitment that you have to make. So this is the work to do it. And it turns out that you become pretty much a support function. So you turn into someone people come to for support. That's okay. Information support is what we should be doing. That's fine. We should aim for that in the first place. And one tip that might work is, if people are reluctant to create content, you can start to embed, you must write content in people's job descriptions. If you've got a cooperative HR and management function, then you can say, you will be expected to write up information on your particular special areas, the things that you are subject matter experts in, and that's part of your job. May or may not be helpful, but it's it can be useful if people ask you, why should I do this? I've got lots and lots of other things on my plate. You can say, well, it's part of your job. So that can be helpful in terms of selling it internally to individual people and content. So that was my presentation. I guess if we can have any questions now, I'll be very happy for that.
Thanks so much, David. I have a question. So that was a great look at the, I guess, the sort of the process and the stakeholder management for document creation. Coming from the technical writing field, do you look at sort of efficiencies in the content creation itself? Things like content reuse or aligning to structured taxonomies, that kind of thing.
Yes, and we haven't got an official content management system for all of our content at the moment. We've got about 14 different platforms for delivering content, and much of the other hats that I wear as an information architect is simplifying those systems. So I wish I were exaggerating when I said 14. It's probably, but it is probably about that many different platforms. Part of the rationalization and reducing duplication work that I'm involved in separately is to reduce the number of platforms. It's much easier to, if you have got things in different systems, different platforms, different teams, then it's much easier to or to duplicate, to reinvent the wheel. So part of the job, another part of the job that I'm involved in is reducing those platforms and developing a proper taxonomy and reuse processes around information. Yeah. But of course, the more people are involved in content themselves, the more people write content, the more people create videos, the more they themselves see the duplication. So again, it's pushing this out, down, pushing it left, pushing it down to people say, hold on, I wrote this exact same thing 6 months ago. Let me dig that up and reuse that. So that happens on a more organic basis by actually pushing this responsibility down. But yeah, another part of my job will be to actually properly implement a system. At the moment, we're probably veering towards something called Gitbook, because that's quite developer friendly. And it is Git-based system. And then plugging in a headless CMS on top of that, possibly Contentful. I'm a bit skeptical, but maybe we can plug that in. We've got clever people who can do this, and that's great. But that will be my plan to implement that in terms of the actual architectural systems we put in place.
Thanks. And a related question from Irina. I hope I'm saying that right. Thanks, David. Your story resonates with me a lot. What trainings do you offer your teams in things like writing and grammar and style, as well as the creative side?
So initially, the training I'm rolling out is purely about writing. So it's plain writing. It's a 1 hour session, and I usually do it in small groups with a number of exercises. And I usually do 2 or 3 of those a week. And that's basically on anyone who's involved in creating content and avoiding the obvious pitfalls. What I found is that we've got a multicultural company. A lot of us based in Israel use English as a second language. They're actually usually better writers in terms of plain content than native English speakers, who tend to be quite flowery in the language and use maybe longer sentences, more complex constructions than others. But after I've done the plain writing, once I've implemented that, once I've got that through, what I'll then do is start thinking about things like editorial champions. I'll start maybe extending this to people who are more interested in more depth training. And of course, we'll start saying, right, you've got the content writing down. Now let's start thinking about the architectural side of things. Think about reuse, think about variables, embedding and representing content in different ways. So lots of work to do, but yeah, that initially plain writing training, get the basics done first.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Well, that's all the time we have for that. Thank you to David for that wonderful talk. After the break, we'll be staying with language as Francis Gordon comes to talk about overcoming our cultural biases to deliver content more effectively. But we're going to take a quick comfort break now, 20 minutes, and we'll be back here at 2:40 p.m. GMT. See you then.